Hey everyone, this is Paul Bertorelli reporting for AVweb. With me in the Zoom room is Congressman Jay Obernolte of the California 23rd District. That's up northeast of Los Angeles. Congressman Obernolte is an experienced pilot and important to our discussion today, he's also been an airport board member, so he knows how small airports work. So, Congressman, we've been reporting on the 2023 FAA reauthorization bill, which has gone through a number of amendments, which is normal. The one we're most interested in has to do with fuel and replacement fuels for 100 low lead. Originally, when that bill came through, uh, the amendment read that an airport could not stop selling 100 low lead unless it had an approved unleaded fuel, 100 octane fuel replacement. Now that language has been changed. Would you go over what you did there?
Sure. So back in 2018, when the FAA was last reauthorized, you probably remember that we had several communities across the country trying to close their airports and try and weasel out of their AIP grant restrictions. Obviously, we have an airport improvement program that provides grants for airport infrastructure. But the deal is, if you are an airport and you take one of those grants, you are committing to keep your airport open for a couple of decades. So we had communities back then who were trying to get out of those restrictions by withdrawing the sale of fuel, any type of fuel at their airport. And their hope, I guess, was that if they did that, then all the traffic could go away and they could close it. So obviously that was, we thought, a moral violation of the whole purpose of the grant restrictions in the AIP. And so in 2018, a new restriction was added to make it clear that if you withdraw 100 low lead from being sold at an airport, that is a violation of the AIP grant restriction. So that language was again in the FAA reauthorization this year. Now, I'm sure most of your readers and listeners are familiar with the fact that for a couple of decades now, we have been trying to get an unleaded avgas substitute certified, but we've been hampered by the fact it's a very complex task because the lead is there for a reason. It's to boost the octane of the fuel, because some high compression piston engines depend on that octane being high, and they detonate if it's not there. So
let me just ask you a question here on the 2018 bill. So is that language still going to be applicable in the 2023 bill on the requirement for fuel sales?
Right. So it was first passed in 2018. It was still there in the original reauthorization bill this year. So what I did, we had airports, that because we're finally approaching the point where we might in the next couple of years actually have an unleaded avgas replacement that's certified for use by the entire general aviation piston aircraft fleet. And we had airports that were reaching out to us saying, hey, this language is a problem because we only have a single set of fuel infrastructure. We only have a single fuel truck, or we only have one tank, or we only have one pump. We can't offer unleaded and leaded aviation fuel. It's got to be one or the other. And we're concerned that this language means that if we switch from leaded to unleaded, that would be interpreted as withdrawing the fuel from sale and therefore violating our grant restrictions. And so that's why I offered an amendment to make it clear when there is an industry consensus standard on 100 low lead replacement and it's certified for the entire fleet, then an airport can switch over to that without violating its grant restrictions. So that's what the amendment does.
Okay, that clarifies that. And I want to get to the consensus standard in a minute. But first, your press release on your website says we've capitalized on recent innovations to allow FAA approved high octane unleaded aviation gasoline to be sold at airports in lieu of low lead, 100 low lead. What innovations are you talking about there?
Well, we're talking about the entire industry. I mean, obviously, there are a bunch of different fuel companies that have been trying for the last decade a bunch of different approaches. Just recently, we've had GAMI that went the supplemental type certificate route that has succeeded in getting an STC that can be applied to any piston engine aircraft. So their fuel is available, but you have to have an STC to get it, which you have to purchase from them, and then you have to have an outlet that supports it. And then we've got another industry consortium that's going the FAA route, where they want the FAA to bless their fuel for the entire fleet. That's not yet occurred, but that might be on the horizon within the next year or two. I think that they might be able to get that done. So, this is going to be the end of a 20-year journey of trying to get the lead out of aviation fuel.
Let me ask you about the STC. Do you have any problem with the STC approach?
Only that people have to buy it. So, that's something. That's why we put the language in there for requiring industry consensus standard. Because if you are going to require someone who's maybe a transient aircraft, and the only fuel available is one that requires an STC, if you're going to require them to buy the STC just to fuel that aircraft, that could be a problem.
Well, let's talk about the consensus standard. So that was inserted, as I understand it, at the behest of AOPA. The language is it has to be an industry consensus standard, and we're referring to an unleaded 100-octane fuel here. Do you think that's important because of what you just said? Because of you wouldn't need an STC, but in fact, the two are separate issues. The STC is the approval process, but the consensus standard is it's an ASTM spec approval. So you could very well have an ASTM spec fuel out there that still requires a STC.
Yes, certainly. I think the number one concern that we had is that it was widely available to everyone, because we are essentially giving airports permission to switch fuels from 100 low lead to whatever the new fuel is. We want to make sure that everyone is able to use that new fuel. And that's why we require that a consensus in the industry that fuel is acceptable as a replacement.
Do you think it's practical or desirable for a small company like GAMI to be allowed to start to field this fuel without having the consensus standard?
Well, I mean, they are doing that, and God bless them for doing that. They have been working now for many years on this problem, and GAMI. You've done interviews with them. They are great people. They really have taken this seriously, and it's very encouraging that they've gotten so far in the process. So we're trying to be agnostic about whatever the new fuel technology is, as long as everyone can use it and it's widely available. We think airports should be able to switch to it.
Of course, they can't field that if they're required to have a consensus standard, because they run into the same problem with the single tankage. So the bill has language basically to protect the airports that have single tank systems to accept only a consensus standard fuel, which of course G100UL is not. So according to GAMI, this kind of puts up a barrier that's very difficult for them to overcome, the consensus standard, that is.
Sure. Well, I mean, to be clear, though, the barrier was higher before the amendment, because they were looking at a situation where no airport would be able to allow to switch at all if they only had a single fuel infrastructure. Whereas now we're giving them an exception. When the industry reaches consensus, then airports can switch. So although it might not be everything that GAMI wanted, it's certainly a lot better than the language was before.
How confident are you that the Paffy process is going to give us an approvable fuel that's both meets the technical standards for 100 octane with regard to detonation resistance and aging and all the rest of it in this time period? Because we both know that between 2014 and 2018 they were not able to do it, and the program, after almost $40 million spent, really didn't yield much useful. So do you have enough visibility into this program to be confident that it's going to yield at least one fuel?
Well, I am optimistic about the technical fuel standards being met. I have concerns about other things that might prevent the general switch to an unleaded fuel. Things like the availability of the fuel and the cost of the fuel. I think that if you rolled out a fuel that cost, I mean, just to pick a ridiculous example, twice as much as low lead, you'd have a lot of resistance for people to switch. So that's been our problem is how do we get to a point where we have nearly price parity and widespread availability, and then everyone I think will say, well, this is much better, we're going to switch over, even if it means having to buy an STC for their aircraft. But until we get there, it's more problematic.
In California, in 2014, some of the airports and FBOs and oil companies were sued by the Center for Environmental Health. They have in place a consent decree, which basically the skeleton of it says that if an unleaded 100 octane fuel becomes available, you have to switch to that from the 100 low lead that you're selling now. Nothing in there about consensus standards or STCs or anything like that. Are you worried that we're not going to see some lawsuits around this? Because technically, well, not technically, it's a fact that G100UL is an approved fuel. It's an FAA approved fuel. Does not have a consensus standard. But so now how does that relate to some of these airports wanting to get rid of 100 low lead and put in 100 octane unleaded under threat of lawsuit?
Right. Well, I mean, unfortunately, the lawsuit ship has already sailed. As you point out, those lawsuits have already occurred. They're going to continue to occur. What we're trying to do with the amendment is to just give airports some surety, a kind of an escape clause that they're not going to be violating their airport improvement program grant assurances by switching. Because without that assurance, the language in the FAA reauthorization said that they would be violating their grant assurances. So we're just trying to actually ease the transition.
Now, you're a board member at Big Bear Airport, northeast of Los Angeles. Is there a demand there? Do you sense there's a demand for an unleaded fuel now?
I haven't actually spoken to the current airport administration about that. I would think that as you point out, I'm an active pilot. I have over 5,000 hours. In fact, I get to go fly back from DC to California tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. So, my sense of the pilot community is that they aren't resistant to switching to an unleaded fuel. I think most everyone realizes that lead's not good for the environment. It's not good for humans. It's not good to have at an airport if you can avoid it, and that we kind of have an environmental responsibility to switch when we can. So I don't think there's a lot of pushback. The pushback overall is around the logistics. Like, well, when can I do this? What do I have to do to make it work? Are we sure it's going to be safe for my aircraft? Because safety is number one. And then, of course, what is it going to cost me?
Let's switch gears here. You also have an amendment language in the reauthorization bill that requires airmen practical test standards to be completed and I guess revealed to the applicant within 14 days. Is that correct?
It's not the standards. It has to do with the timing of a.
I'm at the test. The test.
So the problem that I was hearing about from the pilot community is that we were having some applicants face delays of up to a year when they applied to the FAA for a practical test, depending on what they were applying for. A year between when they applied and when either an inspector or a designated pilot examiner was available to give them that practical test. And I mean, I think we should all be able to agree that's completely unacceptable. And we know as pilots, and I certainly know as a flight instructor of almost 30 years, when you're ready to take the test, when your flight instructor has signed you off, you're ready then, right? If you wait 3 weeks, you're not going to have the same level of proficiency. Proficiency is a perishable skill. So we think it's that a 2-week maximum is a reasonable thing. The FAA actually agrees with that assessment. And so my amendment requires an accountability study that puts the FAA on a path to always being able to offer a practical test within 14 calendar days of when an applicant requests one.
Is this a resources issue? Are they going to need more DPEs and just generally more budget to do this?
I think that they will need more DPEs. DPEs are not something that necessarily costs the FAA a lot of money because obviously a DPE is by definition not an FAA employee. So it might require an investment in more certification of DPEs. It might require an investment in better technology for scheduling and being able to move the resources to where where the demand is from the standpoint of practical test applications. But the first thing that needs to be done is to create a plan for getting it done. And that's what we're requiring the FAA to do. And that amendment, I'm very happy, was actually incorporated in the FAA reauthorization bill that passed the House this week.
In the 2 minutes we have remaining, this is kind of out of left field. The FAA released a statement this week that said it won't use Chat GPT to write computer code for air traffic purposes. Now, you are a bit of an AI expert because you're a tech guy and a computer person, and you studied AI. What's your reaction to that, or in general, what the FAA needs to be doing with artificial intelligence relative to aviation?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, it's early days with respect to artificial intelligence. That statement from the FAA opened my eyes too. It really kind of perked my ears up. But when I looked into it, here's the situation. There was an executive order that required all of the agencies of the federal government to report the applications that they were using AI for. And this makes sense because we're trying to get a whole of government sense of where AI is being used, because we're trying to craft a regulatory framework around AI. So it was reported back that the FAA was using AI in some of its air traffic control software. And that really kind of alarmed people because it's nothing any of us had heard of before. So the statement from the FAA was just to say, no, that was a mistake. We are not actually using currently AI in any of our air traffic control applications. So it wasn't that they felt the need to come out, proactively about it. It was they were correcting an error that had been made higher up in the administration, and there are questions that were being asked about it.
Should they be using it?
Well, I mean, this is a long conversation. The answer is almost certainly there will be applications for which it is appropriate, it increases productivity, and it is safe. But safety is always job number one, and that's why we want to make sure we're putting up the appropriate guardrails to ensure that agencies can use AI in a way that's both beneficial to them and safe for the people that they are serving. And so, but as I said, it's early days. Right now, that's probably not possible for them to do.
Okay. All right, Congressman Jay Obernolte, thanks very much for giving us the time.
Absolutely. It's great to talk to you.